Welcome again, everyone. My name is Ben Marlin. I'm a faculty member in computer science at University of Massachusetts Amherst and associate director for Mass AITC. Today's webinar is going to be the first in a series of talks that will focus on foundational topics related to technology development, human factors, and study design and deployment. The second talk in the series will be given by Professor Pedja Klasner from the University of Michigan. That's coming up on May 23rd, and will focus on developing useful and usable health technologies for older adults through user-centered design. Announcements for that talk will be out shortly, so keep an eye out for that event. Today, we're very happy to be hosting Dr. Ed Ramos to start this series of talks. Ed's the co-founder of the Digital Trials Center at Scripps Research and Chief Scientific Officer at Care Evolution. Ed moved to Scripps and Care Evolution following 7 years at NIH, where he worked as a program director for NIBIB and led enrollment operations for the All of Us research program. Ed's talk today is going to focus on digital decentralized study approaches. As folks may know, Mass AITC has a particular focus on technologies to support aging in place, as well as at-home care of individuals with Alzheimer's disease. So digital study approaches that are better able to meet these individuals where they are of significant interest to the center. In terms of logistics for the talk, this is a reminder that the talk is being recorded. We also ask that folks hold their questions until the end of the talk. We should have lots of time for questions and Q&A following the presentation. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Ramos. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. Let me get my screen share going here. Well, very much looking forward to this and sharing a lot about what we've been working on at the Digital Trials Center at Scripps Research. Obviously, as the center's name implies, we're really focusing on developing this shift from a kind of clinic-focused, clinical research study, clinical trial approach to something that's a little bit more decentralized. So I'll be touching on opportunities that kind of fall in the space of a digital decentralized study approach, as well as some very specific use cases in terms of the research platforms that we've launched in the last few years, and then just kind of ending on how this intertwines with the current landscape at the National Institutes of Health, with some specifics on solicitations that kind of are geared towards leveraging some components. So first, I'll level set on how we view a decentralized digital clinical research study, what that means to us, what are the pain points that we're trying to address, as well as what are the aspects of a decentralized study that we're trying to really leverage in an efficient way. So thinking in terms of the traditional model and whether it's a clinical trial in its kind of more purest sense as something that's focused and geared towards a regulatory pathway, or something that is kind of falls into the clinical research space, which is a lot of what we do. A lot of it is focused around that brick and mortar facility. So the clinic is obviously a big part of how the studies are designed and modeled after. And so that typically means then that recruitment is oftentimes relegated to that surrounding patient population. So for the potential research questions that you have, the patient population may not actually reflect those individuals that will likely benefit the most from the questions that you're trying to answer. We're also placing a significant amount of burden potentially on participants in terms of now being able to access and identify how to access the clinic site. Obviously, you need boots on the ground, you need a study coordinator team that is a large part of the onboarding process. We call that kind of a very high touch experience in terms of the human in the loop, really being a part of those initial onboarding and enrollment phases of the study. Obviously, if you're doing things like biosample collection, whether you're collecting blood or saliva or something else, there's potentially now a need for additional trained professionals that may be a part of the process as well. And then if we're looking at layering data and collecting other types of biomarkers, you're somewhat limited to whether or not those are more fall on the episodic side of things with regards to participants only coming in at set times for a particular study, whether it's every month or every quarter, or perhaps even every year. Your capture of what it is you're interested in terms of layering additional data are oftentimes kind of limited to those time points. So While this was a bit of a validation for us, it always brings a smile to our face. So this was actually literally a section of the New York Times that was called Unintended Consequences, in which we were now almost a year post COVID-19, or rather post initial COVID-19 cases in the United States in 2020. This article published in 2021 that was kind of highlighting this move outside of clinical trials, moving out of the lab and directly into people's homes. And obviously this was a function of everything just shutting down as a result of the pandemic, and really trying to get an understanding of how do we continue to move trials forward without access to these brick and mortar facilities, without the ability to convene individuals like the study coordinator team to really guide participants through the particular study or the trial. And so for us, the kind of acknowledgement was really around something that Eric Topol, who had developed the Scripps Research Translational Institute and has really been pioneering digital medicine. A lot of these kind of rethinking and bringing on a new paradigm was born from much of what has been tested and pushed out in the field years prior to the pandemic. So this knowledge, or this idea of really building around the clinic, flipped in terms of how do we start putting the participant at the center, really kind of reducing the burden and really trying to identify those areas in which we could potentially scale. So if you're thinking about a patient population that's focused on a geographic area, you now have the potential for really anyone, anywhere, if you're looking to leverage a more digitized kind of smartphone app-based experience. The access burden is potentially reduced. So someone that's thinking about how am I going to take time off work, or what is the bus route? It's going to take me 2 hours to get there, or who's going to pay for parking, while seemingly kind of nominal variables to consider, they can have a significant impact on who you're actually recruiting into the study. So if the burden is finding time at your own pace and you can do it wherever you like, the potential there is to really improve access to the clinical trial, the clinical study, with hopefully a emphasis on the ability to really target and enroll those individuals from underserved and underrepresented populations. The study coordinator team that I had mentioned, the boots on the ground, the human in the loop, high touch, however you want to describe it, can now potentially be reduced, if not removed from the equation, with a potential self-guided experience that's delivered by a study app. This notion of being able to collect biosamples is not necessarily limited to an in-clinic brick and mortar facility, and we can give you some specific examples of how we've leveraged self-administering biosample collection kits from anything from blood to stool samples to saliva samples, which obviously allow for a significant collection of data beyond just survey-based data that you'd be able to push over the phone. And then, of course, this idea of digital health technologies, of which new ones seem to be kind of hitting the surface every other week. I think the unique aspect of this is not even so much about what it is we can collect, but how much of this data we can be able to collect and what that means. So, for example, if you're bringing a person into a clinic quarterly, obviously, again, this notion of only episodic capture could potentially be expanded to using something as simple as a physical activity tracker, like a wearable or a Fitbit, a Garmin, what have you, that is now delivering this information in a more continuous basis. And I think the important layer on top of that is you're now collecting data much more reflective of the participants' real world versus something that's kind of contextualized within a given clinic. So all of these components are really just kind of set the stage and start thinking about what are the traditional components that we're often considering in terms of designing a model, and what does the digital decentralized approach really offer, and how can we start flipping mindset in what are the potential limitations, and as well as the opportunities for building out studies with this particular paradigm in mind. So with that backdrop, and as I mentioned, with a lot of work that we had done in years prior, we were able to launch the Digital Trials Center with my co-founder, Katie Buckamotes. And these are just some snapshots of some of the previous studies that really laid a lot of the foundation, either in proof of concept or proof of principle, or really just kind of giving us a sense of how do we scale, how do we make this anyone, anywhere. That really gave us a significant amount of confidence in terms of being able to make this and use this as a viable option. Of course, when COVID washed ashore, it accelerated this lens that I think now has been adopted by many in the research space as a real viable option for building out models, clinical trial models, clinical research studies. The other aspect that I've hinted at already is really this contextualization. So it's one thing to be able to gather information in more of a real world type of environment. The other is the ability to really kind of go deep, pivot, focus on what it is, some of the more nuanced questions that maybe potentially could be of interest in your overall research agenda. So whether it's focusing on social determinants that impact disease progression, to even something as simple as geography. So this notion of anyone, anywhere can really help with kind of the second box there example of, does a Latino living in the Northeast have similar outcomes to a Hispanic living in the Southwest? And this more decentralized manner, our approach rather, doesn't provide those, or doesn't breaks a lot of those boundaries that would otherwise make this difficult to really capture in a given research study. And then, of course, we have other kind of secondary and tertiary layer data that of interest, whether it's whether or not where a person lives, if it's a rural area that could potentially affect prevention, or specific to whether you're on the coast or in the center part of the US. How does clinical history potentially inform health outcomes? And that has to do with the ability to access that data and layer it into a variety of different analytical approaches. And so I'll get to specifics that really kind of start shining a light and illustrating how you would be able to put a lot of this into action. And so with the Trials Center launched, and with kind of a good footing on how we can potentially start framing a lot of these research efforts over the last 3 years, we've launched 4 major research platforms. So the All of Us research program was something that had been in the works. For those of you that are familiar, this is an NIH-sponsored effort that falls under the precision medicine initiative, and has this very ambitious goal of enrolling 1 million or more individuals, but ultimately just kind of landed as another potential use case for us. Specific to the center, we've launched now 4 platforms that focus on sleep medicine, and that's our Refresh study, on precision nutrition, which is our Progress study. We launched Detect, which is in direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and Power Mom, which is focused on maternal health. And I'll just kind of pull some examples that really highlight the strength and the underlying concepts and philosophies of a digital decentralized trial. So we'll start with COVID. It really turned into the ultimate use case. Everything shut down. How do we continue our research? How do we continue to enroll? How do we recruit? What type of data can we even potentially gather? And how do we evolve in this kind of siteless, remote manner in terms of running a study? So in terms of a timeline, because I think speed and scalability is a big part of this, when COVID hit in 2020, it just so happened that the Scripps team had just published a couple of papers that were focused on leveraging wearable data from a Fitbit specifically looking at a digital biomarker in resting heart rate and being able to use that at a population level for surveillance of influenza-like illness. And so when COVID hit, there was a significant amount of overlap there. And so it was a quick pivot to say, to really establish the hypothesis of, can we leverage the digital biomarker data that's getting pulled from, again, wearables like Fitbit, your kind of off-the-shelf physical activity trackers. Can we use that for some level of prediction and analysis of onset of COVID-19? So we very quickly put a protocol together within a matter of a few weeks, and we're able to launch, and within 3 months enrolled over 35,000 participants, in the first 4 months launch of the study. Obviously, the context around this is extremely unique. This was a pandemic. I think everyone was interested in trying to learn more about what this really meant, especially as it meant to them as an individual. But the actual onboarding was extremely lightweight and low burden. So we really try and build out these decentralized research studies as more of a baseline study. So it was a pre-consent screens that really broke down what it is you're getting yourself into as a participant, what are the expectations of the study, and what are kind of the core values and promises that of the study team to you as the participant. And that includes things like security and privacy and so on. Then they're presented with a traditional long form screen, and all of this was within the Detect study app that is downloaded by the participant. They connect their wearable if they have one. Again, all integrated within the technology platform, and they basically let us know when they're not feeling well. So they get pinged every couple of weeks for, hey, do you have any current symptoms, cold-like or flu-like symptoms? And that was effectively the kind of brunt of the data collection. And that was amassed such that we were able to build out a statistical model that showed the influence of digital biomarkers like resting heart rate, sleep duration, and physical activity as a predictor for COVID-19. And then that really started setting the stage for how we could potentially utilize that data for other aspects of COVID, whether it be in response to vaccinations for COVID, whether it be a further insights into long COVID, or other kind of inter-individual variation that we could potentially examine within this now very large cohort, of which we're around about 41,000 participants to date. So that clearly was very much an observational study. Share your wearable data, and that happens in the background. On the more active side, let us know when you have symptoms, and obviously indicate whether or not you've tested positive for COVID-19. And a lot of that kind of helped set up the model that you see here in the upper right with regards to the observational data, eventually leading to what could be leveraged as a predictive algorithm at an individual level. So that statistical model, based on the number of people that we had in the cohort, was able then to be trained through machine learning and ultimately arrive at an algorithm that could alert the participant, hey, you're deviating from your baseline of resting heart rate or of sleep or of activity. You may want to take a COVID test. So this very thin, lightweight baseline study in Detect now could be layered with a sub-study on top of it that actually shifts from observational to something that's a little bit more intervention. So now the participant has an algorithm that's trained directly on them. They're alerted if they deviate from their baseline, and then they're prompted to order a COVID-19 test. Again, all self-contained within the study app. The COVID test was provided as part of the sub-study. and we were able to kind of further push the envelope on how do we evolve the use of this digital decentralized platform for research purposes. I think the one other extremely significant feather on our cap for this particular sub-study, while it obviously wasn't at the scale of the tens of thousands of individuals that we have in the cohort, we still landed at around just under 500 individuals for the sub-study. Now, the beauty of this was because we had amassed that cohort, we could really prioritize certain populations. So for us, a big part of the research that we do and a big part of really pushing this decentralized model is to increase access and increase access in particular for those individuals that are underserved and underrepresented. And so for some of you may be familiar, there is actually a metric that the All of Us Research Program established, which is referred to as UBR, or underrepresented in biomedical research. It obviously includes race and ethnicity, but also socioeconomic status, education status, age, and a number of other factors that kind of feed into that particular categorization. So we were able to take that metric and say, and deploy a demographic survey to the cohort to get an understanding of who would fit this definition of UBR and prioritize enrollment of those individuals. We created a virtual waiting room. We pinged all those that kind of, based on their responses, met the definitions for UBR and enrolled those individuals first. We set a target of 50% of that sub-study cohort to at least match that UBR categories, and 30% to match races and ethnicities that are also captured in that UBR definition as well. We were able to hit those targets in less than 10 weeks, and then kind of open the doors for other participants to backfill the total target number of participants that we're aiming for. So lots going on here in terms of, I would say the main takeaways of being able to, the ability to shift from an observational something more interventional, the ability to kind of leverage digital levers in the background to really start carving out that cohort of interest as we did with the sub-study, and really start to make this and provide information at an individual level. So the other kind of main component here was really around this notion of push-pull. So for all the data that we're asking a participant to share for a given study, can we match that with something that we give back to them? So for the DETECT study, it was this ability to access this individualized algorithm that could potentially alert them of onset of COVID-19. So I'll kind of skim through a couple of other use cases and really get to some Q&A in terms of questions on different aspects of what I'm presenting here. I had mentioned this previously. This is our maternal health study in PowerMom. Many of you are probably familiar with the statistics here in terms of why this is an issue, why it needs continued research. I'll highlight probably the one that is most impactful in that over 3 times Black pregnant women are over 3 times as likely to die giving birth compared to their white counterparts in the United States, with a whole host of other maternal morbidities associated with individuals in underserved and underrepresented groups. And in general, there is a tremendous amount of significant number of gaps in our knowledge of pregnancy that could certainly be addressed. And so we launched PowerMom in response to try and develop a research baseline, again, platform that could focus on collection of data specific to pregnancy. Again, very much lightweight in terms of onboarding. The participant is met with the same type of structure, a pre-consent that kind of describes the study, traditional long form consent, and then the study tasks, whether it's bi-weekly surveys or surveys that are pushed out to capture demographics, postpartum surveys, and other opportunities to share data, including electronic health record data, which again, all contained within the PowerMom app. You're kind of kept to a single ecosystem. But we also brought this sub-study approach, so we can kind of lay the groundwork to build the cohort for maternal health and still collect very relevant data as it pertains to maternal health and pregnancy, but then also really have that as a foundation to set up for deeper dive sub-studies that could really kind of potentially get at very specific questions, whether you want to focus on preeclampsia or nutrition tracking. And one that we've launched that's live right now is in sponsorship with Wobot, which has actually an FDA-approved AI chatbot, which not only does postpartum assessment, but also can do postpartum depression treatment. And so we've integrated that as part of the experience for participants. Obviously, they're pinged after they've indicated that they've given birth and invited to the postpartum study, postpartum depression study, and this ability to access the Wobot tool. So another example of how this kind of baseline sub-study model can work in a completely different context, so shifting now from COVID to something that's focused on maternal health with some different approaches and captures of data. And this is really just starting to build the case for what that multimodal analysis could look like. And this is, I think, especially impactful in the pregnancy space, given, again, these kind of gaps in knowledge that we have. So now you have the ability across the timeline of pregnancy to potentially capture things like weight gain and resting heart rate and blood pressure. You can focus on what the capture of outcomes on the end. So you can start getting a sense here of how this multimodal data collection can go. As you focus on building a cohort that is diverse, both in race and ethnicity, but also in socioeconomic status and in education and geography, just the ability to slice and dice around those particular variables is extremely exciting for us. And I think an extremely powerful data that we'll be able to build out, data repository that we'll be able to build out for pregnancy. Refresh, I'll kind of cruise through this one a little bit. This is focused on sleep medicine. Again, there's a Refresh specific app, study app that we build out. It performs things like sleep apnea screening, insomnia, and again, same thing in terms of a baseline, lightweight study that a participant consents into, with this ability to consent into additional sub-studies that go a little bit deeper. So one that we're getting ready to launch is focused on neurocognitive outcomes in women, leveraging this existing Refresh cohort that we built out. Progress is unique. This is really just kind of showcase the features and functionalities that you could potentially tap into with regards to the technology backend. Progress is different than some of the others in that this is not a baseline sub-study. We kind of came out of the gate going very deep and focus on precision nutrition. It's looking to enroll 1,000 individuals split between those that have been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and those that have not. But we've implemented here a number of biosample collection that's done by the participant. This is completely self-guided. So we have blood collection. This is we're leveraging a touch-activated phlebotomy device. For those of you that aren't familiar, it basically has a suction cup on it. You slap it onto your arm, you push a big old red button, and a micro needle collects blood from capillaries at the surface. And that fills out a cardstock, and then you mail the whole thing back to a CLIA certified lab that can do a variety of different assays. So for us, we are confirming HbA1c status. Genomics was captured by a saliva kit, microbiome from a stool sample collection kit. And even that we were able to iterate on, not to go too deep into that, but when the initial collection kits was using a little shovel, and we were working with a company that was extremely innovative, and we were able to convert that to just a wipe that's used and pushed into a 50 ml tube that with a plunger, you push that down, you send it off. So again, all these things that can be guided by the app through videos, instructionals. The participant always has access to the study coordinator team via email or even phone if it requires it. Again, for progress, very much referred to it as the kitchen sink study. Beyond the biosample collection, we also ask individuals to wear a continuous glucose monitor. They wear a Fitbit, so we're collecting those kind of traditional digital biomarkers as well. And they're also maintaining a food diary for that 10-day period that the CGM is collecting blood glucose values. So I wanted to go a little bit into detail on that, again, just to kind of highlight what it is you can do, and some things that may have previously been thought as limitations are actually can be operationalized and deployed in this decentralized manner. Again, this is a topic near and dear to my heart, and certainly something that we focus on at the center, and just want to touch on how you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, especially in the context of digital research trials. These are things that you're all probably extremely familiar with in terms of the diversity part being reflected in the upper left here. We're not even at a representative percentage with regards to trial participants compared to the US population, let alone if you're looking at the epidemiology of specific diseases and what that representation should be. When we think about equity, there's an example in sickle cell compared to cystic fibrosis that I think illustrates this. When you're looking at the disease population, over 3 times more sickle cell patients that are predominantly Black or Hispanic. But if you look at the funding, cystic fibrosis really receiving 10x the amount of funding, despite the kind of reduction in disease population. So diversity, equity, and the inclusion part that I've kind of alluded to already, when you think about clinical trials not being able to reach their recruitment targets, much of this is really kind of powered by access to these clinic sites, where in 70% of patients live more than 2 hours from a research. That's a lot. You're asking a lot of participants, especially those that don't have the means and the ability and availability to really kind of overcome this hurdle to be able to access a clinical trial. So this notion of DEI, I think, can be addressed in a more efficient way in leveraging a lot of the tools that we kind of set forth in this decentralized remote paradigm. And this just tries to hammer this home a little bit more. I alluded to it already in terms of FDA guidance, really trying to promote DEI in what I think is a very useful way. This is just a very, very small excerpt of the draft guidance, but an important one in that as you're thinking about developing this cohort, who is it in terms of populations that is most likely to benefit from this? And that likely means getting an understanding of what the epidemiology of the disease is. So if you're Hispanic or Puerto Rican, the kind of disparity that we see in type 2 diabetes, I've already mentioned statistics around pregnancy-related deaths for Black pregnant people. And then of course, the other example, probably more germane to this group in terms of those that are female, more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, as they make up 2/3 of the AD patients currently. So it's one thing to point out, hey, shine a light on DEI, you really need to acknowledge this. It's another thing to offer up some tools. So I had the benefit of sitting on a tour of duty with the Digital Medicine Society that focused on the development of DEI tools. And so I highly encourage you all to take a look at this. Each one of these buckets, whether you're assessing, identifying, or implementing, really break out into a very deep and I think very thoughtful collection of tools that could be leveraged in any kind of aspect of the life cycle of putting together a digital clinical research study. So I'll end with, as I had mentioned early on, with how this intersects with funding agencies, in particular NIH. As Ben mentioned, I'm coming off of 15 years of working at the National Institutes of Health, both as an independent researcher, but also as more on the administrative and programmatic side as a program officer, working in the extramural space. This was a recent and actually ongoing, I believe the deadline for this is end of next month or around that. So a request for information on advancing clinical and translational science through accelerating the decentralization of clinical trials. And I highlight this because I think it's important to recognize the recognition by NIH of the space and how they're viewing decentralized clinical trials, or DCTs as they refer to them, really kind of seeking input on how they may be designed to be more effective, efficient, and equitable to bring more interventions to all people faster. So I don't think this is something that you can skip over in this space. I think it's something that's continually going to be integrated in a variety of different solicitations. And I've highlighted here the major buckets as NIH is viewing DCTs, whether it's a focus on community engagement or workforce development, study participation and adherence, and all these other things that are reflected here. At the very least, I recommend taking a look at the RFI, and then certainly as NIH collates responses, what the publication of those responses look like, and to get a better sense of how the field is viewing DCTs as well. And to make this a little bit more concrete, and what I'll end on is a very specific solicitation. So I'm sure many of you have eyes on this recent FOA from the National Institute on Aging, which is focused on Alzheimer's disease and AD-related dementias, really trying to focus on this real-world data platform. And just in that title alone, you can see the shift from this desire and need to contextualize the data that we're collecting and really putting it in a real-world kind of setting, such that we can get to real-world evidence as derived from that data. And that's an important kind of definitional distinction with regards to RWD, really leading to RWE, but really this FOA looking to set the groundwork for how do we build up the infrastructure to collect this. So there are a number of different cores that they outline within the solicitation. I pulled out 3 that really highlight the intersection now of this paradigm shift in how we look at clinical research studies and clinical trials, whether it's the trial innovation core that's seeking to leverage tools for digital, decentralized, and virtual clinical trials, whether it's the clinical research network core, very specifically stating here to establish a virtual trial recruitment platform, or the access and data quality and integration core, which is seeking to serve as this multimodal data access for the U54 awardee that's part of this AD real world data platform that they're trying to build up and support. And even specific things like data quality and missingness and links to CMS claims data. I highlighted that because even that within For example, the My Data Helps platform, which we leverage from Care Evolution. There is the ability, as I mentioned previously, for participants to connect their electronic health record data. They can also connect to their CMS provider. And so this EHR and claims data is accessible to the researcher as well. So really starting to think about, oh, well, that's great, but do the tools actually exist? Yes, the tools do exist, and you really can kind of come at this in a very holistic and comprehensive way. So threw a lot at everyone, happy to answer questions and any bits of that, but really just wanted to set the landscape for how we view digital decentralized trials, what specifically have we done in this space, and then ultimately how can it continue to be used, and as you can see very specifically in the AD realm with some of these newer solicitations that have hit the streets.
All right, that was great. Thank you very much. We will move into questions. So I'm going to kick it off. So just following up on the last slide that you were showing, the new RFA around Alzheimer's. I'm wondering if you can comment on any potential barriers specifically for the deployment of remote trial designs for older adults. So this is obviously something that's of great concern to to our audience and to our current sort of pilot awardees. So these kinds of methodologies where you're looking at maybe having people use wearables or maybe more involved biomarker data collection protocols and things like that. To what extent is it known whether there's sort of disparities in people's ability to participate, follow study protocols as a function of age?
Yeah, it's increasingly becoming probably one of the #1 questions we get. And rightfully so. So a couple of things to this. First, I would say if we were even talking, 5-10 years ago, one of the main hurdles would just be what is the ownership of smartphones across various different demographics. And I think there's significant data now to show that that is likely to be less of a limiting factor. And not to say that technology won't introduce some hurdles here. So if you check the box for smartphones, you can say, all right, well, I really am going to design a BYOD, a bring your own device kind of model. Then you are getting into some demographic issues with respect to, does everyone, not everyone has a Fitbit, or not everyone has a Garmin or wearable. And so it's an important point to bring up for a number of obvious reasons, but one to also think about, all right, can we start partnering with a Fitbit, with a Google to ensure that we don't make that a limiting factor? So now you have to be cognizant of building that into the budget and so on. Just as a side note on the kind of digital technology access side of this. Specific to older adults, as we were putting that precision nutrition study together, a lot of this has to do with obviously going through your participant tasks. So just one for blood collection, initially we're like, okay, well, it's push a button. What's so difficult about that? And so when we actually there's about 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 that are on the market, and we were testing, there was one that had 2 buttons, and you had to push down while you hold it and then push the other one in the center. The finger strength needed for that initial push, I mean, all of us were on Zoom and we were testing it out, and we were just kind of leveraging something as seemingly innocuous as that could really put a wrench in that particular specific participant task, in which you now have to have that consideration of finger strength for those older adults. And so we really went for the one that was, with as easy as possible in terms of being able to utilize the mechanism for a blood draw. I will also say and I already have permission from my mom to disclose her as a participant. Again, in that precision nutrition study, she's 77 years old. And not to throw my mom under the bus, but I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get an email or a call every 5 seconds from her in collecting blood and stool. How do I operate this and so on? And to be honest, I didn't give her nearly enough credit. And she was the mom that was like, help me program the VCR when I was older. So she wasn't coming into this as a very tech savvy individual. And so I say that obviously that's an N of 1. but that this assumption that older adults equals not technology savvy or technologically savvy, I think is false and requires quite a bit of groundwork to really get an understanding of where those obstacles and hurdles actually are. So whether that means focus groups or we've put together a virtual advisory team that advises us on all of our research platforms, and it's comprised of very specifically non-scientists, non-researchers, and trying to be as representative of the general population as possible to really give this type of feedback. So it's a great question. We don't have a silver bullet for that, and really the main takeaway is to not make assumptions on either side. Oh, they'll be able to do it, or oh, they won't be able to do it. It really requires a significant amount of testing and a feedback loop.
Great, that's great. Thank you. Other questions? Go ahead.
I'm just going to go ahead. Hey, Dan Rubin from University of Chicago. I had a question about that I think kind of follows up on Ben's question in terms of the user interface for older adults in particular with the mobile application. Are there certain things that you have learned through that process that you could share to enhance usability, you know, in terms of text size, in terms of button placement, in terms of how to navigate through and how to organize the user interface so that it kind of creates that seamless nature or usability that you kind of described older adults are much better at in terms of participating?
Yeah, so some of this is just to ensure that the tech stack and the tech platform that you're using is able to check a couple of boxes for you. So for example, if you're if you're leveraging a study app that kind of ignores the default settings for a particular smartphone, obviously that's not going to be very helpful. And so you want to ensure that, you know, the kind of painstaking preferences that somebody sets up on their smartphone are obviously reflected within the study app as well. And that probably very specifically refers to text size, colors, sounds, and so on. Other than that, I think many of our studies aren't older adult specifics. We have them as part of the cohort. And so a lot of this is feedback. So at an individual level. So for example, again, the precision nutrition study using the continuous glucose monitor, I would say the majority of the kind of customer service and study coordinator service that we have to do for that is stepping them through application of the CGM, and which, you know, is understandable because it's not something that anyone really uses on a daily basis. And so just the educational part of that, sometimes it's the need to just having a voice on the phone, giving them confidence to be able to participate in the task. And then the other is recognizing that for a lot of older adults, this opportunity to speak to someone is something that they're very interested in. So it may not be part of, and we actually see this in the email communication. So they'll email not just one question, but maybe 10 questions, and it'll be 10 back and forth because there's this kind of notion of a back and forth communication and this relationship that they want to build up with a study coordinator. And maybe that's more of a cultural thing as well as individuals that are of the older population. But specific to the UI, I'm trying to think through the Rolodex of different features and functions that we've had here. We haven't necessarily adapted specifically for older adults, but I think the general tenets that we adhere to help as well. And that is kind of keep the language simple, keep the tasks simple, keep the complexity down, and more importantly, ensure that we have some kind of return of health insights so folks feel like they're not just giving, but also receiving something in return. So more on the behavioral side, Daniel, versus the kind of operationalizing the UI side of things to answer your question.
Great, that's great. And as we noted off the top, we will have a next webinar focused specifically on user-centered design. So if folks came in late, definitely stop in and check that out in about a month. Misha, go ahead.
Yes, this is an exciting presentation. Many studies actually benefit from the longitudinal aspect of these studies. And what happens is that engagement is a huge issue in many of these studies. And I was wondering how, if you have any thoughts about it, because if you start interacting with the participants, you are intervening, and that you might not want to do.
Yeah, no, great question. So on the longitudinal aspect side of things, our DETECT study, for example, has been running for a few years. And so I think it really depends on what you're seeking to capture in that longitudinal space. Is it active data collection or is it passive data collection? So you could potentially view it as a positive for a digital clinical study if you're asking somebody to connect their Fitbit and connect their electronic health records. That's more of a set it and forget it thing that can happen in the background for an extended period of time. If you're looking for them to fill out biweekly surveys or even quarterly surveys, then yes, you have to keep in mind, how do you maintain their engagement, especially with a study app that they're only using once every 3 months. And so we've employed a couple of different mechanisms to try and facilitate that continued engagement. So for DETECT, for example, we have a digest that goes out to remind them that they're participants in the study. It has 3 kind of relevant articles to that particular research area. And the engagement tries to happen at more of an educational level. And also just a reminder, hey, thank you for your participation. We want to at least kind of keep you in the loop in terms of how the research is progressing or what's happening on the outside. So just a couple of things that can be done. If it's at a longer cadence, let's say every 6 months or even once a year, then you really need to start thinking about potential other incentive models, whether it's an Amazon gift card to kind of bring them back into the ecosystem, or other types of financial incentives or other motivations as well. If it's really just day over day keeping them, then that return of information and that return of health insights has to kind of match that cadence as well. And you can do that through data visualization of some of the data that you're collecting, for example. And so I'm abbreviating my comments because I think we're getting close to the hour here, but hopefully it gives you some illustration.
Thank you.
Right, we're just about out of time, but Deepak, go ahead. I think you've been in the queue for a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. This was a great talk. So just quick question. Do you think about the validity of the data, and as you scale these trials and as you make them fully remote, I mean, eventually these kinds of trials will influence policy, even now, right? Influence policy, or there might be financial incentives at the end of the study that results from it, right? So how do you view the whole validity of data? And of course, with the tools we have today, anything can be faked. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, a lot to tease out there, and I'll try and hit on them quickly. So for the validity of data, I think there needs to be an understanding of what the limitations are of those digital biomarkers that you're collecting. So if you're looking for an exact count of steps, for example, then that's probably the wrong lens to have. If you're looking to exploit the delta in steps from 1 week to the next for a given individual, then that particular wearable is appropriate. So whether or not it really was 11,000 steps, the fact that it went from 11,000 steps to 3,000 steps can be leveraged in kind of profiling and doing trend analysis. If you're looking at something like blood pressure, for example, where you actually very much need to know that that value is validated, because there's a difference in 5 points can mean whether somebody is pre-hypertensive or hypertensive or not, then there more rigor needs to go into that particular situation. And on the regulatory side, we've had a number of conversations with FDA, and whether their concerns are, as a regulatory body, they now need to figure out, how do we validate data that was collected by effectively 1,000 different people versus data collected by a trained professional in a given clinic, and those are ongoing conversations, and that I think really is just going to have to be data-driven conversations to show the power of really being able to leverage signal over noise in those situations.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks. So I think we're at the hour, so we're going to capture Amar's question and handle it offline. Let's everyone thank Ed for a great webinar, and hopefully we'll see everyone in about a month for the next one. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.